we'll just let everyone start to fill in and then give it a few minutes and then we'll begin, but welcome back. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our afternoon session of our Drafting Resolutions workshop. Thank you for joining us again in the afternoon or in the evening or whatever time it is, wherever you're tuning in from. I hope you found the earlier session extremely beneficial, and I'm sure you're about to find this session just as helpful in the process of drafting resolutions. So I wanted to remind you that we are recording today's session and it will be available on our website, which I will circulate the link to all participants following once it's published. But without further ado, we will start with our next speaker. We have Ms. Tomoko Iwata, who is the Senior Legal Affairs Officer at the Office of Legal Affairs. So without further ado, Tomoko, I will hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon or good whatever. Sorry, I'm still trying to get used to the fact that people may be joining in from all over the world. So I hope for those that are based in New York, I don't put you to sleep. It is after lunch, so I'll try to keep it a bit lively, but it is quite procedural, and as you know, it can get quite technical, so I apologize in advance. So to start off with, I know you've had a full morning of briefing on various issues, but I'm going to continue with the rules of procedure. And to start off with, I wanted to just discuss the issue of quorum, which is contained in Rule 67 of the Rules of Procedure. And in essence, what it provides is it allows the president to declare a meeting open and to permit a debate when at least 1/3 of the members of the GA are present. But for any decision making, you need a majority of the members to be present. Now, that's what the rule says. And I know this morning you had a discussion about the agenda. So in that portion, I believe there was a discussion about the work of the General Committee. So the General Committee, as part of its work, makes a number of recommendations to the General Assembly, including on the issue of quorum. So I just wanted to, so the General Committee's reports are usually always A, session number /250. So if, for any session, if you want to see the GC report, you can always find them. It's the same number. And for this year, it's A/75250. And what it recommended in terms of the issue of quorum is that and this is not the first time it has done this, and in accordance with past practice, it waived the requirement that at least 1/3 of the members of the assembly needed to be present for plenary meetings and 1/4 and 1/4 for the main committees. So it waived that requirement, but it did also say in its recommendation that it does not imply any change with respect to Rule 67 and 108 of the Rules of Procedure, and the requirement of a presence of a majority of members needed to be there in order for a decision to be taken. So again, you can start the meeting, you can get the debate going, but in order to take any decision, you do need a presence of a majority of members in the room. So 97 states need to be in the room to take, member states need to be in the room to take action on any decision. So just to note, maybe on the issue of quorum, this is for the GA and the main committees. It does not, there's in June, usually there's quite a number of treaty body meetings going on. So these requirements would not apply to them. It would also not apply to meetings of states parties. So just to note that this is really for the GA. And there have been recent cases where we have had to wait for quorum in order to take certain decisions. And usually the first decision, at least with respect to subsidiary bodies and other treaty bodies, is the election of the chair. So we do encourage everybody to be there on time. Now, the second issue that I just wanted to touch upon is the issue of revision and amendments. So, these words are often used interchangeably, but it can mean quite significantly different things in the context of the General Assembly. So a revision is usually referred to when the proponent of a proposal makes changes to its own draft resolution or a draft decision. And you may have seen documents, draft resolutions, which are issued as L.10, and then another version of that is issued as L.10/Rev1. That is a revised draft resolution. It doesn't say revised draft resolution at the top, but it is a revision that is made and issued at the request of the proponents of the draft resolution or decision, and it is the revised draft resolution that will be usually put to the Assembly for action. Now, compared to that is an amendment. An amendment is made usually by those that are not a, so a proponent, an amendment is one that is made usually for which the proponent is not agreeable to. So for example, but that is not always the case. So usually, I am the proponent of a draft resolution, and I have put that in OP1 that a conference is to take place from 10 to 20 June, and it's to be held in New York. And an amendment could be that it's held from 10 to 20, but it's held in Geneva. Quite significant differences. If I, the proponent of the draft resolution, want to include Geneva and want to revise it and issue a revised draft resolution saying 10 to 20 June in Geneva, that would be a revision. If I can't agree to that, right, if I'm the proponent and I don't agree to changing New York to Geneva, then it's possible to submit an amendment to the draft resolution that I am proposing and put it forward as an amendment. So what does that mean in concrete terms? And so amendment would normally be taken up first. So you would take up, in accordance with the rules, the amendment to a draft resolution first and would consider it. It doesn't automatically mean that because it's an amendment, there would be a vote on it. There's been recent examples where a vote has not been requested on an amendment and it is adopted. And if it is adopted, then the draft resolution as amended would then be considered for action. So once it's adopted, you no longer have the draft resolution without the amendment for consideration. Once it's adopted, you're considering that package for adoption. And again, you can have a vote on the amendment. You can also have a vote on the draft amendment as amended. And so these are options that isn't, just because the proponent is not agreeable to revise the draft to include the changes, that doesn't necessarily mean that the amendment will be voted on. So that is a few words about amendments and revisions. On explanations of vote before and after the vote, this is also often referred to as explanations of position before and after the vote. And that's because, and I'll come to the issue of consensus a little bit later on, but that's because in the General Assembly, quite a lot of draft resolutions are adopted by consensus. And there is sometimes sensitivities about using the word explanation of vote because you're in the end not voting. But in accordance with the rules, we just refer to it as an explanation of vote before and after the vote. You can either you can either make an explanation before the vote or after the vote. In the practice of the plenary meetings of the General Assembly, generally it's one round of EOVs before or after the vote, whether you have an amendment and a draft resolution or whether you only have a draft resolution. And there's a little bit of a difference in practice between the main committees and in the plenary, but just to note that there's one EOV and you're supposed to explain the position either on the amendment or on the draft resolution itself. So in that case, and as you know, sponsors are not allowed under the rules to make an EOV. But in the case of the plenary, particularly where action is being taken on a draft resolution to which an amendment has been submitted, you may find a situation where the proponents are making an EOV because it's an EOV on the amendment rather than on the draft resolution. So I hope I haven't lost people thus far. So that's EOV before and after the vote. Again, only sponsors cannot make an EOV. But they may be able to make an EOV should action be taken on a draft resolution and an amendment together in the case of the plenary. In main committees, things may be slightly different, so it would depend on the committee in which the action is being taken. So now we get to the procedural motions, which always gets people a bit confused. So, if you do have questions, please, I don't know if we're allowed to take questions midway, but I hope that if I'm losing people, just please let me know. So in essence, the three procedural motions that I wanted to raise are adjournment of debate, Rule 74. Rule 75 is the closure of debate, and then we go on to suspension and adjournment of the meeting. And I also wanted to refer to Rule 75, which is not in the agenda itself, but it's Rule 71 is on points of order. And just to note that you can make a point of order, and it is possible to challenge, for example, a ruling of the president under Rule 71, in which case it's to be immediately put to a vote. So, one example, and this was a high-profile example from the 64th session of a point of order where a ruling by the president was challenged, is a case where during the general debate, actually, there was a point of order. And usually, general debate, there's no points of order, there's usually no procedural motions. But that's probably why we all remember it very well. So the head of state of Madagascar was slated to speak. The Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Democratic Republic of the Congo made a point of order on behalf of the SADC member states, and he challenged the ruling of the president that the head of state of Madagascar could speak, and that was actually overturned by a vote, and the head of state actually of Madagascar at that session did not make a statement during the general debate because the president's ruling that he could speak was challenged and overturned. So that's one example. Again, it's a very rare example, and I'm not saying this is likely to happen anytime soon, but it is a concrete example of a point of order against a ruling by the president. So I just thought I would share that. Now, adjournment of debate is confusing, and you know, many people refer to it as a no action motion. And if you look at the rules, people will say, well, you know, there's no reference to a no action motion. What is people talking about when they say, well, Rule 74 is a no action motion, right? That's what it's often referred to as. What it says is, you know, you can move to an adjournment of debate, but how does that actually lead to a no action motion? Now, you can make an adjournment of debate either on an amendment or on the draft resolution, right? There's examples where you've had an adjournment of debate just on an amendment. You've had cases where there's an adjournment of debate on the proposal on the draft resolution. So that is possible. What that means in concrete terms is that you're not going to take action on either the amendment or the draft resolution. I know the adjournment of debate doesn't sound like the fact that you're not taking action, but that is in fact how it's been interpreted and how it has been applied in the General Assembly. So if there is a draft resolution that is proposed and I make a adjournment of debate motion under Rule 74, what happens? You have 2 speakers in favor, 2 speakers against, and you immediately go to a vote on the motion. If motion passes, what that means is that the draft resolution will no longer be considered and you move on to the next item on the program, right? So really it's you're trying to kill whatever draft resolution or whatever action is being proposed under the item. So one example of a no action motion, or rather, sorry, adjournment of debate is at the 98th plenary meeting of the 72nd session in June 2018. So 3 years ago. And there was an agenda item that was being considered, which was entitled Protracted Conflicts in the Guam Area and Their Implications for International Peace and Security and Development. So I'm just going, just to illustrate how this works, I'm just going to give you how the adjournment of debate worked in this context. So the Foreign Minister of Moldova introduced the draft resolution. It was draft resolution L58, entitled Complete and Unconditional Withdrawal of Foreign Military Forces from the Territory of the Republic of Moldova. After the statement by the Foreign Minister, the Russian Federation requested for the floor on a point of order and proposed an adjournment of debate, also known as a no action motion. There were 2 speakers for and there were 2 speakers against. The motion was rejected by 80 votes to 24 with 48 abstentions. So because the motion was rejected, the Assembly then continued with the consideration of L58. And ultimately, the draft resolution was adopted as resolution 72/282 by 60 votes in favor, 15 votes against, and 83 abstentions. So that's one example of an adjournment of debate. So if in that case, the motion had carried, so the motion had been approved, the motion had enough votes than against, then they would not have considered L58. They would have moved on to the next item on the program. So the agenda item would really have finished at that point. So I hope that is clear. The closure of debate, on the other hand, is proceeding to action. So if a motion is made on closure of debate under Rule 75, and if that is successful, then the list of speakers for the debate would end. You can't make any proposals. You go straight to EOVs and then to action on the draft resolution or draft decision, and then EOVs after, and then that is the end. So these two can get confusing, and we did have a situation in May where the adjournment of debate and a closure of debate was confused by delegations, not in the GA, but actually in Vienna. And just to note that closure of debate, you want to go to action. It's a motion to stop people from speaking and talking about the item, to stop the debate, and you're going to action. That still means that you have to do an EOV before and after, but you can immediately go to action. Adjournment of debate, on the other hand, means if it passes, then that's it. No more consideration of the draft proposal, no more consideration of any amendments. So that, in essence, should end the consideration of the item, unless the debate is still ongoing. But usually when it's done, it's usually right at the beginning of the action stage. So very, very contrasting motions, one going to action and one stopping the action. So just to note, adjournment of debate, there's a number of examples. I personally have not seen a closure of debate motion made in the plenary of the General Assembly. There, member states are very reluctant to essentially stop the debate, given the importance of allowing everybody to express their views. Now, suspension and adjournment of a meeting is much, much less drastic than the adjournment of debate and the closure of debate that I've just made reference to. And the president of the General Assembly suspends the meeting all the time, right? That's one of the powers, and he suspends the meeting where he believes that it's necessary. But if it's controversial, if only one member state wants to suspend the meeting because that delegation is against, taking action on something, then you can make a motion to suspend or adjourn a meeting. A suspension is for a short time. An adjournment would mean you would come back to meet on the matter at a different meeting. So either in the afternoon or some other day of the week or some other month. So short and long is a difference between the two. And again, there hasn't been that many examples of a suspension of a meeting in the plenary, but maybe what I can refer to you is an example from a main committee. The third committee was considering, I believe, a draft resolution at the time, and on a proposal, a proposal was made to suspend the meeting by a delegate from the United States, which was rejected by 73 votes to 33 with 33 abstentions. So there has been an example in the main committee. And for a suspension, you can always make a proposal. It will be put to a vote in accordance with Rule 76. That would be, and they, I think in the cases referred to, there was also a similar case in the 74th session, whether it was a vote in the third committee for a suspension of the meeting. And at that meeting, it was to seek a legal opinion. But again, it was rejected with 18 votes in favor, 88 votes against, and 37 abstention. So there are examples where this motion has, a suspension motion has been used in the main committee. So it's always possible to do so. Now, I wanted to move on to the issue of voting. And it is an inherent right of every member state that you have one vote in accordance with the charter. Now, if you are in arrears in accordance with Article 19 of the charter, then automatically you may lose the right to vote. And this usually happens in January when the new year comes in, that there are some member states that goes into arrears, 2 years arrears in accordance with Article 19 of the Charter. And as soon as you pay, so it is automatic that you lose your right to vote, but as soon as you make the payment, it is also automatic that you regain the right to vote. Just in relation to Article 19 of the Charter, there is also a resolution that is usually passed around October by the General Assembly. So the Committee on Contribution makes a recommendation concerning a number of member states that are in exceptional circumstances and that they should nevertheless have the right to vote, which is allowed under the Charter. And that is considered by the Fifth Committee, and based on a recommendation by the Fifth Committee, the General Assembly restores the right of voting for a number of member states for that particular GA session. And also just to note in relation to Article 19, it applies for the plenary and to the main committees, but it does not apply across the board to all subsidiary bodies. So it applies to the plenary and to the main committees. So in the subsidiaries, you may still retain the right to vote, even if you are in Article 19. So that is on Article 19. What I wanted to touch upon before going to voting on amendments is that proposals and amendments in accordance with Rule 78, and this is often referred to as the 24-hour rule, even though there is no 24-hour requirement. But in accordance with Rule 78, proposals and amendments are to be submitted and circulated to all delegations not later than the day preceding the meetings. So it should be issued in all 6 languages no later than the day before the meeting on which action is to be taken. It doesn't say 24 hours before action is taken. It just says the day before. So it can be issued at 11 p.m. technically for action to be taken at 10 a.m. the following day. I also just want to note that it is possible that even if it's not issued in all 6 languages, there are cases where amendments are made orally, and there's two different steps to be taken. So the president, in terms of amendments, even if they have not been circulated, can have that to be considered. But in terms of proposals, it should be submitted in writing in all languages and circulated the day before, unless the GA waives the requirement that it be issued in in accordance with Rule 78. And there are cases where the GA, due to some time sensitivities, waive the requirement under Rule 78 and goes on to consider a draft resolution, even if it has not been issued in all languages. I mean, I know my colleagues in DGACM do their best to have it issued in all languages, but again, there is a bit of a difference between an amendment and a proposal. In this case, a draft resolution or a decision. So amendments don't require a waiver, whereas a draft resolution or decision technically does. So as I said earlier, amendments are voted on first before the proposal is taken up. So if you have an amendment to a draft resolution, that will be taken up first. The issue of the required majority is one that is important here because an amendment will have the same required majority as the main proposal, as the draft resolution, right? So that is contained in Rule 84, which talks about decision of the GA on amendments to proposal relating to important questions, and on parts of such proposal put to the vote separately shall be made by a 2/3 majority of the members present and voting. So whatever you apply to the main proposal, the main draft resolution, in terms of the required majority, it applies to the amendments. And the rules foresee two different types of decisions in accordance with the charter. The so-called important questions, and there's a category of decisions that the rules are reflecting what the charter provides, and that's in Rule 83, which requires 2/3 majority of the members present and voting. This includes issues such as the admission of new members. It includes the elections to the Security Council, elections of members of ECOSOC. It also includes budgetary questions. So there is a finite list based on the charter. There is also, however, a possibility in accordance with the charter and as reflected in Rule 85 that would allow the General Assembly to take a decision on other matters that should require a 2/3 majority of the members present and voting. So in essence, if you think that this is a really important question, it doesn't quite neatly fall within Rule 83, you can still nevertheless, the Assembly could decide that this matter, given the importance of the issue, requires a 2/3 majority of those present and voting, and that is in accordance with Rule 85. So what does it mean? I've kept on referring to members present and voting, and what does that mean? So in essence, there's 3 ways of voting. You can vote in favor, you can vote against, so for and against, and you can also vote abstaining. So an abstention is not considered as voting, and what the rules provide is, in essence, we're only taking into consideration the votes in favor and the votes against, right? So it's only an affirmative or a negative vote, and essentially what the rule says is if you abstain, then you're not considered as voting for the purposes of members present and voting. So when you look at whether it has the simple majority or not, or the 2/3 majority or not, you're looking at those who voted in favor and who voted against to calculate the required majority. So it's also possible to vote on separate paragraphs. And when you're voting on separate paragraphs, when you request for a vote on separate paragraphs, it's also possible that there is an objection to voting on separate paragraphs. And that would be an objection to the division of, and so based on that, you would first vote on whether to hold the separate paragraph votes. If that succeeds, then you would go on to vote on separate paragraph votes. So I hope that part is clear. I wanted to go through a number of examples on voting with where there has been cases of procedural motions and so on, just to give you a sense of how it, how some of these have worked in the past. So one example that I wanted to provide was at the Resume 10th Emergency Special Session held in June 2018. The 10th Emergency Special Session has been going on since 1997. And it, based on the resolution adopted at each Resume 10th Emergency Special Session, it can be resumed upon a request from member states. So in this case, it was resumed at the request of a member state. A draft resolution was tabled A/ES10/L23, and a draft amendment contained in L24 was also before the General Assembly. The proponent of the L23, the draft resolution, was Algeria on behalf of the group of Arab states, chair for that month, and Algeria on behalf of all the sponsors of L23 put forward a no action motion on the draft amendment. So first procedural motion was a no action motion or an adjournment of debate. The motion was rejected by 78 votes to 59, with 26 abstentions. So the motion was rejected, so you continue with the consideration of the amendment and the draft resolution. Therefore, there was next a vote. As I said, you have to take a vote on the draft, on the amendment first. So there was a vote on the amendment. And the results was that there was 62 votes in favor, 58 against, and 42 abstentions. So if it's a simple majority, 62 is more than 58. And the PGA announced that the draft amendment was rejected. And the US, the amendment had been submitted by the US, and US made a point of order that asking why the PGA had announced that the draft amendment was rejected, because the US stated that it was, in their view, the required majority was a simple majority. And again, Rule 84, amendments to important questions that I touched upon earlier required 2/3 majority. And so the question turned on whether the main proposal required a 2/3 majority of those present and voting, which the PGA announced that in his view, it required a 2/3 majority. It was an important question on peace and security matters. The US appealed the ruling by the PGA that it was an important question, right? So again, a ruling by the president, a challenge. The appeal was rejected by 72 votes to 66 with 26 abstentions, right? So the appeal was rejected, which meant that it was an important question and therefore it required 2/3 majority of those present and voting, and 62 to 58, there was no 2/3 majority. So the amendment was not adopted, right? It was rejected because it didn't meet the required majority. Therefore, you proceed to the vote on the draft resolution, L23 not as amended because the amendment was not adopted. So L23 was put to a vote at the request of a member state. It was ultimately adopted with 120 votes, adopted with 120 votes in favor, 8 against, and 45 abstentions. So I know that was quite a lot of information, but that's a case where there was quite a lot of the procedural motions that I've referred to earlier, and I thought it was a good illustration to show how it works in practice. Now, I just wanted to touch upon 3 issues very quickly. The question of consensus. Now, does consensus mean unanimity? Does it mean everybody loves this draft resolution? No, it doesn't. Essentially, what we have said, and there are some UN Juridical Yearbook opinions from 1974 and 1987, some very old Juridical Yearbook opinions by the Office of Legal Affairs, which states that general agreement and without a vote is the same as consensus. So it's generally understood to mean that it is an adoption of a decision without any formal objections or without a formal request for a vote. So it doesn't mean that everybody loves it necessarily. You can disassociate and a draft resolution can still be adopted by consensus. But once there is a request for a vote, the consensus is broken. Withdrawal of motions, just to touch. So you can withdraw a motion so long as it has not been amended. You can withdraw sponsorship even if it has been amended, but action will be taken on the draft resolution as amended. So I propose a draft resolution for consideration and action. There's an amendment that is proposed. I don't like the amendment. The amendment carries and is adopted. I can withdraw my sponsorship from the proposal, but the proposal is still going to be action because it has been amended and it no longer belongs to the proponents, but it belongs to the General Assembly. The reconsideration of proposals, again, that issue has not it has come up in theory, but not in essence or in the GA recently. But essentially, if you've adopted a draft resolution or if you've adopted a resolution on the matter earlier in the year and you decide to change your mind and actually, instead of wanting B, you want C, then that would be a reconsideration, which would require at least 2/3 of those present and voting. And lastly, if you do have errors in voting, it is possible to record corrections, and you can do that through. So if you had, if you see that in the voting results, your delegation voted for in favor of the draft resolution, where in fact you were supposed to vote against, right? And you need to change. You need to submit a voting correction page. Then it is possible to do so through the delegate portal. So there is a new module there that would allow you to register that, and that would be reflected in the official records, either in the verbatim records or in the summary records. So with that, I hope it was clear. I hope it was clear. I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, so we have a question here from Mary Martinez, who asks, can a member abstaining from voting immediately be granted time to vote subsequent to the plenary? Is this allowed?
So when you are voting, the secretary will usually say, can all delegations confirm their vote on the voting, that is up on the screen, and you can either vote in favor, against, or abstain. And again, if you abstain, but you meant to vote in favor or against, then you can submit a voting correction. It's not ultimately going to change the results, but you can register, and in the official records, it would be reflected that your delegation had intended to vote in favor or against. So in that sense, a correction can be made.
Great. There was another question from Bianca. This was a little bit earlier in your presentations regarding the rules of procedure section, but she asks, is there a time limit for the explanation of vote?
10 minutes. Sorry, 10 minutes in the plenary of the GA. The main committees may have different rules on that.
Great. We've also had someone request for you to repeat the example on Madagascar that you mentioned earlier.
Yes, so it was at the 64th session. The PGA was from Libya at the time, and it was against the head of state, I think President Rajoelina, if I recall his name correctly, and at the time, Madagascar was suspended from SADC and the South African Development, I think, Community. Sorry, I apologize if I got the acronym wrong. Sorry, I don't know what the C stands for. Sorry, in my notes I just have SADC, and it was made by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the DRC.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Tomoko. This has been a really informative presentation. As always, you're always a very vital part of this workshop. So we thank you so much for sharing your expertise with the community. Thank you very much. All right, so next up we have, this is our last panelist of the day. We're nearing the end of our workshop. So I would like to introduce you all to Mr. Fernando Marani from the Office of the President of the General Assembly, who will be speaking to you briefly on decision-making in this process throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. So I will turn the floor over to you, Fernando, and I will screen share your presentation as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison, and good afternoon, everyone. And well, hello, wherever you are around the world. Thank you first for the invitation to touch base on these topics. We will start with a bit of how is the situation and how has been the situation in the framework of COVID. I think that still we are in COVID time, and I have to say that we are very proud that during the 75th session, we managed to bring the GA back to normal functioning, in the sense of meetings being in person and resolutions being adopted through the standard rule of procedures, and that has been an achievement of this session. But that the situation, as you all know, in New York has really improved a lot in the last month, so that we benefit with that. I will like to touch base a bit of on a background on how was the situation last session, on the 74th session, where the first report of COVID-19 starting to appear in New York, and how the GA adapted to try to be able to find a business continuity despite the challenges that the pandemic created. Myself, I started on the Office of the President on the 75th session. That was September last year. But before that, I was legal advisor of the mission of Argentina at the UN. So I was following this process from the other side, from the side of member state, and Argentina at that time was also a member of the General Committee. We will see it was also a big part on solving the issue of business continuity. So the information that you will get from me is a bit of a hangover report from my colleagues from the 74th session, my experience on the Argentinian side, and what had been happening on this session since September 2020 until right now. As I said, by March last year, it was clear that the global health crisis was bigger than we all expected. We started to have the first lockdown happening in New York as well. At the time, we thought that maybe the situation was going to be only a couple of weeks, that we would have to be locked inside without possibility to meet in person at the UN headquarters. But after a couple of weeks, it was clear that the situation was going to extend on the time, and member states starting to request that a solution should be found to try to guarantee that essential issues are addressed and by the General Assembly. The first point that I wanted to make today is that the GA was not prepared to work during a lockdown. I will touch base on some of the rule of procedure and some of the working methods that stress specifically for formal plenary meetings of the General Assembly. Those are the meetings where resolutions are formally and decisions are formally adopted. The GA was not ready to work in a manner that was not in person. There was no foresee of any alternative to work outside of the traditional manner. And then under the leadership of the president during the 74th session, there was Ambassador Mohamed Bande from Nigeria. After we realized that the situation was going to be more complicated than we expected, and other stakeholders starting to take place on virtual platforms to try to find an alternative to have a business continuity on the GA. Also, a lot of principles were identified as ways to, that we have to try to find to secure as a way to solve the problem of how to make the GA work when no person could be taking place on the UN headquarters. And that's something that we will touch base also later before we get into the actual resolutions and procedures. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So what about the rule of procedure? Why would say that the GA was not prepared to work in another manner that was not in person? And you could see there's different mentions in different part of the rule of procedures that make a call that meetings has to be in person. One, for example, is Rule 3 that states that the General Assembly shall meet at the headquarters of the United Nations unless convened elsewhere in pursuance of a decision taken at a previous session or at the request of the majority of the member states. When you see the rule on quorum, for example, again, the president may declare a meeting open and permit the debate to proceed when at least 1/3 of the members of the General Assembly are present. And then, and for example, on voting, if you go to Rule 87, it says that the General Assembly shall normally vote by shows of hand or by standing, but any representative may request a roll call. But even it have a reference to mechanical means. It says that when the General Assembly votes by mechanical means, and no recorded vote shall replace a vote by show of hands or by standing, and a recorded vote shall replace a roll call vote. So the rules are a bit clear on the idea that meetings, formal meetings, has to be in person, and that was the presumption of those who wrote the rule of procedures, and that has been the presumption of how the GA should work. But also, as was mentioned by Tomoko before and early this morning, there are recommendations coming from the General Committee that every year the General Assembly endorse, and one of those recommendations clearly stated not only that the meetings of the General Assembly has to be in person, but also that any video recording or screen projection presentation is not allowed in formal plenary meetings of the General Assembly. So when we were realizing that we were clearly in a situation that was going to last for long, that we were not able to come back to the UN headquarters because it was closed for anything but only essential issues related to maintenance. The president, as I said, together with the Secretary General, with the president of other bodies like president of the Security Council and president of the ECOSOC, they started a conversation with member states to try to find ways to solve this using some of the technologies available. And as you can imagine, with 193 member states, there are completely different views on how a problem like this that was not foreseen before and that was not able to be agreed in advance could be solved. Let me touch base down in some of those principles. So let's go to the next slide. So are some of the principles that starting to being identified, to show up when we were discussing different methods or alternatives to solve the problem that we had. One, of course, was the issue of universal participation. Whatever solution that was brought to the table to make the GA work during COVID-19 should guarantee universal participation. That is, like, all member states should be able to attend and take part. And this is also linked with the question of equal treatment. It was very clear, voiced by several delegations at the time, that not all missions in New York and not all member states have the same access to technology and connectivity, internet speed, security. So that was another of the elements that was brought to the table. The request to have transparent and broad consultations in any solution. And that was, now it seems pretty obvious that we could hold consultations and discussions via any virtual platform. But at a time, that was also an issue. If we have meetings, consultations in a conference room, all of us, we have our badge that identified as a delegate. You could, even to get into the UN, you will have that badge. People will know each other. You will, and you will see the reactions. That was a big step to be able to move from an in-person consultations to a virtual consultation. There was some resistance from some delegations, but at the end, as it was the only way to try to seek to get an understanding of where member states were standing, we moved to virtual platforms to have consultations. And the common ground from after some round of consultations was clear that any solution should be focused only on critical decisions, like the issue of the scope of things that the General Assembly should be able to address during a pandemic was identified as initially as only for critical decisions and limited decisions. The use of virtual tools and to find creative methods was discussed broadly. There was even a facilitation in place on behalf of the President of the General Assembly to find ways to make the GA adopt a decision by voting via electronic means that was not able to deliver a consensual outcome at that time. And there was also the idea that because of the particularities of the situations that we were going through, that the focus should be also on what we call like hard mandates, like to avoid using the resources that we had on soft mandates, and just to focus on issues that were essential to keep the UN working. Some of those issues were like from elections to postponement of meetings. A lot of the meetings that the Assembly organized every year are convened based on mandates coming from resolutions. So to postpone a meeting, to cancel a meeting, to change the date of a meeting, you will need a new resolution or decision that authorize the president to do so, or that state that it's the will of the member states. One last point that I wanted to raise today is the issue of multilingualism. The work of the GA is in the 6 official languages. Any plenary meeting at the Assembly has always interpretation into the 6 official language of the organization, and that was also a principle that many delegations trying to ensure and to secure. The organization was not ready to provide interpretation for virtual platforms at the time. That was also a parallel discussion that took a lot of time, and it was not because of lack of preparedness from the side of the Secretariat. Just for you to have an idea, according to the USG responsible for these issues, in 2002 already, there was a proposal from the Secretariat to try to find ways to have virtual meetings with simultaneous interpretation. And at that time, because how expensive it was, member states decided not to take that project forward. So when the moment arrived and we needed, there was nothing in place. So a lot of efforts were made at a time last year by the Secretariat to try to move the work of the General Assembly from an in-person setting to a virtual setting, to allow to let member states discuss and find common grounds on essential issues, but also to try to keep alive those principles that we have been referring. All these discussions landed, let's go to the next slide, landed on the adoption of a decision in March last year, 27 March of 2020, is decision 74/544. It's a decision that allowed the General Assembly to take decisions by silence procedure. It was the solution that was founded at the time to let the Assembly take certain essential decisions as long as we were not able to meet in person. Some delegations love it, some delegations hate it, but in truth is that this decision allowed the General Assembly to take more than 70 decisions and resolutions being adopted until the end of August 2020. The same model of silent procedures was followed and by other bodies, subsidiary bodies like main committees, or even other principal organs as the ECOSOC. And this decision, what it does, authorize the President of the General Assembly, and this is the interesting point to highlight, is after consultations with the General Committee, to circulate a draft decision to all member states under silent procedure. If the silence is not broken, then it's considered that the draft decision of draft resolution is adopted, and the General Assembly will then, in the first in-person meeting, take note of that decision. But the date of adoption will be that of when the silent procedure is concluded successfully. Also, a method was put in place at a time to have delegations being able to do explanation of positions, even when the process was done through silent procedures. So before the silence procedure was finished or after it was finished, delegations will be able to send in writing their positions as they would do reading on the GA hall. Those explanation of positions will be distributed by the President of the General Assembly or uploaded into the e-delegate as a way to give it publicity. Delegations were also invited to share the explanation of positions through official GA documents that is issued after a letter being sent with that request to the Secretary General. So that is if things went positively, but if the silence was broken by the delegation, then the resolution was not considered adopted or the decision was not considered adopted, and the President could decide to have additional consultations to find a common understanding, and a new draft or revised draft could be issued and circulated. The most important from the legal point of view of this decision is that this decision was adopted and put in place through the mechanisms that itself enacted. So this draft decision was adopted by silence procedure when the silence procedure did not exist. So I think that shows how, when there is consensus among member states, they can rule on how the work of the General Assembly can go ahead, and this has been an extremely clearly example of that situation. And as I said, this was a very successful situation that allowed the General Assembly to go ahead and to postpone meetings, to adopt reports coming from the main committee, especially on the fifth committee, and showed a great degree of success. The biggest, I would say, limitation was when there was no consensus among member states. When any of the members of the 193 members decided to break the silence and there was no way to accommodate its position, then the work of the Assembly was stopped. And because there was no resort to find a way to carry out a voting or any other alternative method that could take place to solve that impasse. Some discussions that were led by the PR of Jamaica at the time on behalf of the President explored the possibility to enact an e-voting mechanism. There were different opinions about member states. Some of them wanted to come to the United Nations even during lockdown to be able to vote. Some others asked to have several conference rooms connected, but that's impossible technologically at the time. Other proposal was to refer the issues to some other UN seat, like in Geneva or Vienna. So a lot of ideas were circulated at the table, but none of the ideas gathered the necessarily support. to survive. Yes. Let me.
I think it might have been an accidental unmute.
Okay, no problem. So that is, and that was the end of the 74th session. So we arrived to August with the August 2020 with the decision 74/544 in place. And by September of last year, we starting to meet again in person. So the need to have the silent procedures in place was not needed anymore. We had a intense October, and then mid-October, a case of COVID-19 was detected on the UN headquarters, and that was in the middle of the session of the main committees. So the president of the 75th session made consultations with the chair of the main committee, and after recommendation of the medical director, the United Nations headquarters was closed for 4 days, to allow tracking and to see if the evaluation, if the measures in place at the time were proper to ensure the safety of all the delegates and staff. So that situation of having to close the UN headquarters for 4 days in October showed that the discussion on the issue of e-voting or electronic voting was not solved, and a group of countries with Liechtenstein leading decided to put forward a proposal of a draft decision of the General Assembly to prevent the situation that if we will get again in a lockdown, that there was no tool available for the president of the General Assembly to take decisions when no consensus was possible among delegations. Different discussions took place, exchange of view about member states, that landing on the 2nd of November of 2021 on the adoption of decision 75/510 on e-voting. The wording of the resolution of this decision is very interesting, and I will touch base on some of the main elements. The idea is that this draft decision is only applicable for exceptional circumstances. The first step is the president of the General Assembly has to determine that under certain circumstances, it's not safe to meet in person, and he has to do that evaluation or that evaluation in consultations with, and this is very interesting. We moved from the General Committee that was on the draft decision on silence procedure to now the chairs of the main committee, and that has to be guided by recommendation of the SG, medical doctor, the Department of Safety and Security of the Secretariat, and the host state authorities. So the first responsibility for the president is to hold these consultations, and if as a result of these consultations it's clear that the GA cannot meet in person, then he has to immediately communicate the result of the consultations on the evaluations to the member states, and to keep on reviewing this constantly. He will then activate the process of e-voting, and now we can go to the next slide. How this is worked procedurally, I won't go into detail. It's a very lengthy decision that really tried to capture all the different procedural tools that are available for member state when addressing a draft decision, so with the caveat that since the beginning, even the proponents of the draft decision knew that it was impossible to reflect everything that is on the rule and procedurals and that could happen on the GA hall to happen in a manner in a virtual stage on every virtual platform. The first thing that after the mechanism of e-voting is putting in place, the first step will be for the president of the General Assembly to circulate a draft proposal. The draft proposal will be put under silence procedure, as we knew in the 74th session, for 72 hours. If the silence is not broken, then it's fine. It will be considered adopted. But then if the silence procedure is broken, e-voting is activated. And how does it work? through a series of letters that will be sent by the President of the General Assembly, informing member state of different steps that the process will be taken, combined with the use of a virtual platform that is, for those who are in New York, at least, you should know that it's called the e-delegate portal, where each of the members of a mission can access and have information related to resolutions on plenaries and little speakers and delegations and so on. So the first step for e-voting is the president will circulate a letter to all the member states announcing that a vote has been requested on a specific proposal, and this will indicate the date and time when the vote will commence. And the moment that this letter is circulated, no other proposal can be made related to this specific draft until the date and time announced by the president, with exception, as it is in the real life or in the GA hall, of a point of order. When the time starts, then the member states will be able to vote in favor, against, or abstain through the e-delegate portal. One interesting discussion that we had at the time is for how long member state will be able to vote, and if other delegations will be able to see what is the votes that members are casting, and the final landing proposal is that the member state will be able to vote for 1 hour. So the letter of the president would say, okay, the vote will start on Wednesday, 23rd June at 3 p.m. and finish on Wednesday, 23rd June at 4 p.m. So a member state will have 1 hour slot to vote, but the vote of each of member state will be only visible to all the other member states 5 minutes before of the closure of the voting period. That in our example will be on Wednesday at 3:55. You will be able to see what other are voting. And that is to try to, on one side, to give member state enough time to vote, to have a window that will allow them to log in if there is any problem to be solved, but that will emulate what happened on the GA hall, that the moment that you are voting, while you are voting, you can see how other delegations are voting, and you will be able to change your vote accordingly if that is, if you made a mistake, or if that is the instruction that you got from Capital. If the votes favor reach the required majority, the proposal will be considered adopted, and then, as it happened with silent procedures, the GA will take note of the proposal adopted and the first in-person meeting. Some of the other issues that the resolution, that the draft decision also address is the issue of the quorum, for example. And the voting process will be considered valid if a majority of the members of the GA are present during the voting process. And this presence is determined by counting those member states that affirm their presence during the voting period. So that means that when you log in, first you will have to say, okay, I'm present in this election, in this voting, and then you will be able to cast your vote. So that shows how the quorum will be registered. The draft decision also foresee the possibility to introduce amendments, and when an amendment is introduced, then the PGA will have to inform member states 24 hours in advance, and then first the amendment will be considered, and then the whole text. The amendment could go and be adopted under silence procedure if no one broke the silence procedure. If someone broke the silence procedure, also the e-voting will be applied for the amendment. And also the draft decision has some information and some ruling on how the procedural motions and the points of order will be applied in this e-voting context, including by the President of the General Assembly communicating to all member states its ruling and indicating a time for the member state to appeal his ruling, and then how the appealing will be solved in case that delegations decide to do it. So as you could see, a lot of the issues that you have been seeing and addressing today during the day we're also reflecting on decision 75/510. This decision was not applied, has not been applied in New York in the General Assembly, but it has been used as a model for decisions being taken by vote on an electronic means in Geneva in the Human Rights Council. So it shows that it could be a useful tool under circumstances where member states are not able to meet in person. I have to say that to conclude, maybe in addition to all these technicalities, something that has been clear for us is that building consensus is much more harder doing it through a virtual means than it is during in-person. A lot of processes in the framework of the General Assembly, including on member state led resolutions, but also on mandates assigned to the president by the member state through a resolution. The consultation is probably the weakest point of all these processes, because the contact person to person and delegate to delegate, the possibility to go into a corner of a room and solve a resolution through working on the language, that has been shown that is very difficult through virtual means. And I think that is one of the lesson learned of this very particular year that we went through. But when it comes to the GA as a body that is unable to hold debates and to adopt resolutions, I'm glad to see that member states were able to find ways to bring those tools to the president of the General Assembly, to keep the GA working even in extreme circumstances where it is not safe or secure to be in the UN headquarters. I think that is all from my side, but if there are questions or clarifications, happy to address.
Great. Thank you so much, Fernando, for that presentation. If we have any questions, I invite you to add them to the chat. I'll leave about a minute for any questions to come in. Okay, well, in the event there are no questions, thank you so much again, Fernando, for everything, for sharing your expertise, for sharing your experience, throughout COVID and how it's changed things here. Well, that leaves us to the end of our workshop. Thank you all so very much for attending. Thank you to our panelists for sharing your experiences, for sharing your expertise. I'm sure it's extremely beneficial to those who have participated here today. I hope you found this information session very helpful, very beneficial for your work. Just a few reminders at the end of this workshop that UNITAR has drafted a publication on guidelines to United Nations resolutions, which will be very helpful as a written source of all of that's been discussed today. I will send the link in the chat. I just sent it, so you can access it there. You can also access the animation that we showed earlier this morning at that link as well. As I mentioned earlier, we also recorded this session both the morning and the afternoon, and that will be published to our website in a few days, and I will also circulate that once it's published. But on behalf of UNITAR New York office, thank you all so much again for your participation at this event. I hope you all come away from it with an increased confidence in the resolution process, and hope to see you at future UNITAR events. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again.
Thank you.